Hey there, and thank you for tapping in to this episode. As it seems in any conversation I have for long enough unstructured, my mind will find a way to bring up ancient Rome. With no fail, my conversation with today's guests tracks to the same place. But this time, I walked away thinking of both then and now differently. In more ways than one, who we are as people, as a species, and even as a culture hasn't changed all that much. Examples like fashion, exploitation, spectacle, politics, profit. The magnitude of those have shifted quite a bit. Lives today are gratefully worth much more, and far better cared for. But one can stay up late at night reading Plutarch, as I have been, or the gossip rags of Scutonius, and find familiar stories, familiar intrigue. People that seem not just for a moment, but what requires deep effort and reminding that these stories and these people in them are murderers and commit atrocities that at any moment would horrify anyone today. Yet why we find those stories so compelling and familiar is that they have many of the same threads that drive people to atrocities that exist today. From political scandals through corporate greed to examples of spectacle, like the Super Bowl, and the human trafficking and prostitution that is most popular on the same day as it. So then perhaps us as a species have largely the same drivers as then. And a divider between us today and them then is the culture and means that we have today. From this conversation, though, I've been spending a lot of overwhelming moments considering just the magnitude of different factors that have played into our current reality as a species, and how that existed then versus now. Everything I listed off earlier is examples of things that haven't changed over time, and many more I didn't mention. They all exist then as today. But the difference with today is the matrix of all other factors within each of those variables that only grows more and more, seemingly by the month. Like how much of the processed foods that are regularly available are terrible for your health. Or fragrances, plastics, receipt pieces of paper, carpets, or how products like paint or beds can give off volatile organic compounds that wreak havoc on our bodies. Those factors may have existed back then. Perhaps a bottle of perfume you'd get as an ancient Roman would indeed be poison. Hell, they did have quite the problem with lead. But the number of those factors that existed for them was far less than what is just existing now. And it's accelerating. And that's just one bit. There's also information technology, which is what most of us assume we're talking about when we just say tech. Even though tech is a much wider term that includes genetic engineering, another scary thing. Social media, all of the bits of users creating posts for algorithms to pick up and push to the most likely of people to get pissed off by it. Then there's the challenge today to understand who to trust, how to identify a person or organization's motives, or the fact that we're often lulled not to consider their motives. How can we trust the media companies to report the truth of a story when they have incentives to push a particular narrative, a narrative they try their best to obfuscate? But at the same time, understand how to challenge someone whose first principles seem sound. They talk confidently and explain these intricate concepts about things like health that to the unaware are complete bullshit. Somewhere therein is about where we find ourselves today, completely confused by the numerous factors of growing complexity while hurling through reality on a giant round rock that feels fixed and stable to us. How then can we contend with that present reality? Well, and this is perhaps where ancient wisdom really does come in hand, because it's about one of the oldest tricks from one of the oldest stories. The trick is to continue on, putting in effort again and again, or how Yusef puts it in brilliantly simple terms, make progress. Life is the story of Sisyphus, where we're all doomed to a fate of rolling a rock up a hill all day long, only to have it slide back down after the sun sets, just to get up and do it again and again. But it's in the choosing of what we roll up the hill, and choosing to get up and do it again, that make all the difference. Choosing to look at it like a game, not as a milestone, as something to have a bit of fun and to keep score. And perhaps, by making progress and showing up, it can help us individually and collectively understand our present reality. Because to improve, we must understand. Otherwise, we're just bashing things with a hammer, hoping it works. My guest for this conversation that caused all this illuminating thought, I found from an incredibly insightful Twitter thread about the healthcare system in the UK. And it was a huge delight to talk to him live. Over the course of the conversation, we hit on how life is a series of sisyphean efforts. Who can we trust at this point online? The media and all its various forms. Before ending on the existential threat of what in our environment is playing against our bodies. I promise you that's a lot more fun than it sounds. If you're looking for a knowledgeable way to get fit, and not just physically but mentally, to be more productive and feel great, I encourage you to check out Yusef and his partner Jonny at propanefitness.com. You can find all about them there, as well as Yusef's Twitter, where he's always posting something great. And with that, we can get into our conversation. Thank you for listening, and I hope this finds you well. Real quick before the episode begins, if you like what you hear, please tap that follow or subscribe button. You also can find this episode, all episodes in the series, or check out our Daily Minute podcast by visiting us at bandwidth.productions.
Certain banned topics or profanity or anything like that?
No. Let the governor off.
Cool. I'm a pretty profane guy, so...
Yeah, I swear like fucking crazy, so you're all good. Excellent. Yeah, well, thank you again for taking the time. Would you mind introducing yourself? And then I'm going to ask you a kickoff question, and then we can just start chatting.
Sure. So my name's Yusef. I co-run Propane Fitness, which is a company that my business partner and I set up in 2008, initially just as a sounding board to get our ideas out on paper. And this was kind of back in the day where you could rank on the first page of Google for like hypertrophy or something. So it was a very different landscape. That interest in physiology of metabolism primarily got us into going further down that role, further putting our ideas up on paper. People started to inquire for coaching. It sent me down a path of quitting my job as an investment or in an investment bank to go and train to be a doctor. So I've done that for the last few years. I've finished my hospital contract and now I'm full-time Propane. The only kind of additional arm of that that's developed a bit more recently is that we now also help coaches and trainers do the same thing. So we help them with their systems to deliver their coaching online as well.
Wow, that's amazing. I knew that you were a doctor because of a Twitter thread that I'll get into in a second of how I came across you. I didn't realize that you went to be a doctor because of the fitness work you're doing, which is amazing. That's really cool.
Yeah, it's kind of gone full circle. I was wondering how you came across me, but yeah, that thread went a bit unexpectedly viral.
Yeah,
it's always the throwaway stuff that seems to pick up, doesn't it?
It's true. Yeah, I look at life as a series of happy accidents. That's where the only way it makes sense to me looking backwards is that everything is just a happy accident. I do want to get into that, but something that I ask every guest when they first join the podcast is I ask everyone the same question, which is, what do you like to do that makes you happy?
Oh, make progress. And that's in any domain. And that's why I feel like if you can choose to play as many games as possible that you enjoy and that you can make progress in, there's a lot of joy to be had in that. I also think that you can kind of hack that by picking things that you are crap at and getting the first 80% of the noob gains where it's most satisfying, the learning curve is highest, and then it's up to you if you want to become elite level and grind out an extra couple of basis points on each on each bit of progress, or rotate and periodize and explore everything else that life has to offer.
Man, I love that answer for so many things. My Twitter handle is actually it's a handle on everything like GitHub or any account is trying to be good, and the whole
Nice.
reason that I have that is the exact pretty similar ethos to what you're saying, which is essentially like I just want to make progress. I'm just trying. Life is an effort. It's not like a series of milestones or anything like that. It's actually just a series of constantly doing sisyphean efforts in different various ways.
100%. The milestones are often empty, aren't they? Once you get there, you're like, oh, well, that's a bit underwhelming. Oh, well, time to move on to the next one.
Yeah, yeah. Or you just end up partying too hard at that plateau you're at and never get to a next one, which is also
Yeah.
something that people fall into, like resting on your laurels, if you will. Um, yeah, it's also I like how you put that it's a game because that's something that I try to get people that are. So I do consulting. That's like what I do in my day job for like software development and like everything from like AI systems. Any crazy thing you could need an assassin to build is what I'll do.
Nice.
And something that I try to get people, both that I work with and they're kind of coming up in the industry and consulting and everything, is I try to get them to look at it like a game, like pure, like, like game theory, John Nash kind of way, which sometimes goes a little bit over people's heads. But, hey, if you could look at everything as just a series of actors and, motives and look at it more as a playful means of something, you're going to end up being happier and achieve more, and probably spot more things. So I really appreciate that, what you were saying with that.
Yeah, it makes sense. Like, if then you can pick which games you want to play, you define the parameters, you do it until it's not enjoyable for you anymore, and then you move on. Um, I think there's also a second meaning in your username there of trying to be good, that probably most of the happiness can be squeezed out of, let's say, the first 80% or the first 60% of learning a skill, of getting good. Going from good to elite has a real trade-off between happiness and progress.
Yeah, you hit on it right away. No, yeah, totally. I reluctantly call myself a polymath. I only reluctantly do it because usually I've noticed it comes with a lot of baggage of people thinking I'm arrogant or self-aggrandizing. And it's like, no, no, no. I just try to get really good at something and then I move on. And I do that with a lot of things. So it just happens to mean that I have a lot of interests that I'm good at, and pretty close. But um, the thing with like getting to be the elite level, and this is actually an analogy that I try to use, and it's like a golf pro. So like somebody who's a golf pro that's at a country club that's meant to teach the members of the country club and be their like professional is the best person on that golf course, and everyone is like miles worse than they are, and it's like, oh my god. And to casual members of the country club, the difference between that guy and Tiger Woods seems to be nominal, but to the golf pro, he's like, no, 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 you don't understand. It's enormous. He's like, the difference between me and an actual professional is the reason why I'm here in this country club versus on the senior tour. And that's something from like an outside perspective gets really hard to see unless you can build the muscle to being like, no, no, I'm going to learn a bunch of things. I'm going to learn this so that what I'm learning is the difference between good and elite. And that's going to give me a perspective enough to be able to bring in anywhere else in life. So the aim shouldn't be necessarily to become elite. Through your actions and your discipline, you could do that. But really, just to understand the levels of something is almost more important.
Yeah, for sure. It's getting to basic proficiency with something, getting over that Mount Stupid of the Dunning-Kruger curve,
Mm-hmm.
and getting to the point where you can see some. Because most people, and for if you've managed to not hear of the Dunning-Kruger effect for anyone listening, it's the idea that if you drive past a golf course, and your analogy, and you see a couple of people holding sticks and just swinging at a ball, and you think, oh, I could do that. It doesn't look too hard. And then you go and give it a go, and you're like, whoa, okay, this is so much harder than I thought. That's getting past Mount Stupid. And then you get a bit better, and then you go into the Valley of Despair, where you're like, oh, actually, this is so much more difficult than I thought, that there's no way I'm going to be able to get better. And then you get better and better, but you're comparing yourself to the elites, and you realize how far you've got to come. And I suppose that's the inflection point where you're saying, okay, now it's time to either say, right, I've got a realistic assessment now of how difficult golf actually is. I can continue and become a good golfer and accept the costs that are associated with that. Or I can say, oh, you know what, I'm happy with my level of crapness in golf and I'm going to move on.
Yeah, exactly. And in like the 80% of the juice and 20% of the squeeze is like a phrase a lot of Americans say, and it's the same
Oh,
thing.
nice.
And you know, there's see, I feel like there's so much that life has to offer, and the more that you learn something, the less that you know. It's like the Socrates quote, like what is wisdom? And he goes, all I know is that I know nothing. And it's something that in today's world I feel like is obvious but not talked about a lot. And I like to call out the obvious a lot.
Yeah, I very much resonate with that. So my medical training, I feel like all it's done is just attune my bullshit filter. I don't feel like I'm particularly knowledgeable on human physiology or anything any more than it's just taught me to be able to catch the ridiculous, stupid claims. And especially on Twitter, especially, you see people that have got the most confidence with the least um, basis for their claims, and it drives me nuts. So I've learned eventually that it's not accepting defeat to just block these people, because they're so stuck in their own echo chamber that you've got to just be like, do you know what? It's not worth my blood pressure. I'm here to promote myself. I'm here to offer some value to people. I'm not going to get involved in the drama.
Totally. Yeah, it's funny how much confidence and arrogance get confused. Right?
Yeah.
It's like you're just being super arrogant, man. You don't know what you're talking about. Versus like, oh wow, you actually know what you're talking about. But once again, that 20% like some people just don't have a ability to spot the difference, which is also funny.
And that's where people get exploited.
Yes, 100%. Yeah. Yeah.
When it comes to medical claims, things that really will have a consequence if they are ignored, then you carry a responsibility with that. Especially when it comes to things which are irreversible, cancer treatments, saying to avoid chemotherapy. I saw one the other day. My Twitter algorithm obviously keeps liking to prod me, but someone advising against taking chemotherapy for pituitary cancer because the body can heal itself with a carnivore diet, and you're like, oh my god, where to begin? Like, I wish it was that simple, but it's not.
No, totally. Yeah. And okay, so just to hang it on that is like the well, we're just such an interesting time because how anybody could talk and anybody could have a say, right? And like it's so murky because I've met so many doctors in my life, in person and online, that I hear them talk and I'm just like, oh my god, dude, like I haven't heard you talk about lifestyle once. And it's like I understand everything you're saying, and what you're saying is true to an extent. But it's like, oh come on, like this person hasn't moved in forever. They don't eat very properly, right? Like not everything can be solved with a pill, right? Which is one end of the spectrum, and then even another end of the spectrum who's like, you don't have any medical training, but you're an incredibly intelligent individual and incredibly well read, and you even if I don't know what you're talking about completely, you seem like you know what you're talking about completely. And in between that spectrum, you have these people who are both trained in their specific disciplines and self-taught people who can end up becoming up with like novel things, like like a carnivore diet for certain autoimmune disorders seems to have some promise. It seems to have some promise, right? But through that, you have people who are grifters, who sometimes are just good at branding and good at playing social media algorithms, and all of a sudden,
100%.
you're like, oh shit, like who the hell can I trust at any point? What's something that's interesting versus something that's valid?
That's a very holistic view of the whole thing. And I think this is what we need, and it's what we're deficient in, which is an integration of those two sides of it. Because, yes, absolutely, preventative medicine is the future and it's required to. But the problem is, at the point of care, many doctors are faced with a patient who either has gone beyond the point of preventative medicine being helpful, or they are unwilling, or there's a financial incentive, particularly in the US, as you say, or they've got a 7-minute appointment in a rammed clinic like in the UK, where they haven't really got the resource or the time or even the referral pathway to pass somebody on to the appropriate thing. And so maybe a combination of those factors, patient being like, oh yeah, diets, quit smoking, stop drinking, whatever, okay, I'm not interested. Because really the people who are going to pursue a healthy lifestyle, they've already done it. They don't need the doctor to tell them. So we kind of end up in this like chasm where you've got a population of people that you're really trying to like, that need that information the most, they need that advice the most, but there's no referral pathway, there's no willingness from them, and there's maybe a distrust of the medical system overall. So how do you integrate the two? In my opinion, it's we need a referral pathway to coaches and trainers and all of this kind of, we've got a health industry and we've got a medical sector, and we need to find a way to integrate the two. Currently doesn't exist, and the world is crying out for it.
You actually brought it exactly where I was going to take it, which is that coaching and some type of like, I mean, almost like an assistant in some means is honestly like what I think it is. Because I have this saying that I like to push, which is that the truth lies in paradox. So like, what is truth? I think once you get to a point where something is paradoxical, that's actually what is capital T true. So like we're in a state where, you know, systems that are set up, these healthcare systems, aren't really able to completely care for everything that somebody needs, because what they're selecting for is events as opposed to selecting for ongoing, continual, integrated, right? And then you have
Yeah, absolutely.
competing things outside the systems, which are like food companies and pharmaceuticals. I'll at least speak from the U.S. perspective because I know that best. Like, our food that's advertised and pushed is completely unhealthy. Even the stuff that's branded as healthy, like Impossible Burgers, is not at all healthy. And sugar is in absolutely everything, and no one talks about that. Like, added chemicals are in absolutely everything, and nobody talks about that. I mean, it's the branding campaigns. I'm just saying, like, you know, how terrible food dyes are is hilarious because of how much people in America roll your eyes, and you're like, no, dude, this is legitimately terrible stuff. And you know, mental health is something that seems to wait until there's an event, just like physical health.
Mm.
But the feedback between the two is actually enormous. So having something that's like a coach or an assistant in some way, assistant, you know, it sounds demeaning, but it's not what I mean. Like somebody that's going to assist you and help you get along and move, because I truly believe that the next 100 years, let's just say that, is going to be lifestyle is going to be the biggest indicator of health, happiness, of ability to navigate in this crazy chaotic world that's going to get wilder.
Yeah, there's a couple of things you touched on there. So the mental health, I think the mental and physical health piece are one. They obviously interact. I don't think it's too woo-woo to say that there is a mind-body connection. Obviously, it's the Cartesian model of medicine that has caused us to separate mind from body for the sake of categorization. But realistically, we're all part of the same unit. It's just a concept that mind is different to the body, and the mind is housed in the body as well. So it physically is something which is related. Now, there is something called the ACE index, which is the Adverse Childhood Experience Index. And this relates to how many traumatic childhood events that someone has experienced. And there's a really strong correlation between that and levels of diabetes, chronic liver disease, alcoholism, COPD, smoking, self-harm behavior. Like the really severe and quite difficult to unpick pathology as an adult. And as you say, once you have the diagnosis of that, once there's the onset of that disease, that's treated as an event where perhaps not smoking 20 years earlier, or having 5 years of psychotherapy, or dealing with stuff at the root would have been the only way to solve it. And we don't have a resourced system or even the political incentives to follow through with that, because there's no continuity. So we end up with this kind of gap where people are kind of stuck, which is a shame.
Yeah, I really appreciate that you brought that up, actually, because that's something that I think should be talked about more, like the adverse childhood events. My wife actually introduced it to me, and because the reason she did is she was like, I was reading this over, and I think you have all of these, and she's like, I think you should take this, and I was reading through it, and it caused me to really look back and be like, oh my God, so somebody's childhood events reverberates through all of their life, right? In a way that I could see through like having to come overcome some things, right? But when I look left and right at my siblings, it's like it's stark to see like, oh shit, like I could see how all of this ripples through, and it's something that's so uncomfortable to most people bring up. So it's taboo to an extent to be like events that happened in childhood from neglect or poor parenting or just something that happened that wasn't talked about or worked through, and how they can happen.
And then if that further increases the chasm if no one wants to
Yes.
talk about it. There's such a high proportion of people who are obese have been sexually abused as a child. No one wants to talk about that. A really high proportion of people with alcoholism as an adult, they the things like, did you ever see your dad hit your mum? Did you ever have a relative touch you inappropriately? All these kind of questions that map onto coping mechanisms and behaviors. And so people rag on obese people. People blame obese people as if it's a lack of willpower or as if it's laziness. And it completely misses the fact that this is a recent thing. It's not okay. What the way I would illustrate it. You've got me on my hobby horse now, John. But the way I would illustrate this is there's a few things in society that we love to throw rocks at. We blame people who are obese. We blame pedophiles because we say that, oh, we're morally superior and they're not because we're not doing that stuff. And it misses part of it that, like, because if you're going to take that line of reasoning, then you're assuming that because you're morally superior, you have the same urges and the same, and if you were left to your own devices without self-censorship, that you would be doing those same things. That's not the case. So clearly something is different. Somewhat they're having to fight something within them that is not present in us. So we need to look at what's the root of that, what's caused that to happen, and just treat people with a little bit more compassion and understanding that maybe the reason they're acting in that way is because of traumatic events that have happened to them and they need the appropriate support and treatment.
Yeah, empathy is everything, right? And a lot of things that I think about is like, what do we actually care about and what do we want to invest in as a society? And if we like, I think about this a lot with prison system in America is a great example. The majority of people who are long time in prison are illiterate. So it's like, okay, so like that, and that usually has to do with poor upbringings, poor environments they were, raised in as children, which once again, the ACE score comes in. The schooling, they were in a good school district, and most likely, even if they were in a good school district, they probably didn't get the schooling they did because they didn't have proper nutrition or sleep or any number of things, right? And
the odds are completely stacked
exactly
against them, aren't they? Like, how do you expect them to not end up in prison if that's the
right.
cards
And
that you're
instead
dealt?
of saying, hey, like, what happened to you? What's your story? Can we sit down and can we just like, can I write a pseudo obituary style story of where you did to get to where you are now, and can we use that as a basis to go backwards, and then can we revisit it, because there's some things you're probably not going to be honest with yourself, let alone me, about things that are affecting you. You may not even be aware of it. You know what I mean? Like I think of lifestyle as a series of habits. John Dewey, the philosopher, has a really great series on this, human nature and conduct. He has like a whole section about habits, and it's amazing. And he talks about how habits both are necessary to creativity and also destroy your creativity. And what he means by that is that you end up getting lumped into these things that happen again and again, and you stop seeing them as things that you do habitually. And one of them may be just poor eating habits. You know what I mean? Like, I suffer actually from poor eating habits. I've done a lot to stop that, but I will occasionally just like, I'm so stressed out. I don't do this anymore, but I would be so stressed out, all of a sudden just start eating. And then before I'm like, like 3 handfuls of trail mix into something, I'm like, what did I just do? Like, I was going to go downstairs to do something. You know what I mean? And it's that kind of programming.
Oh, and yeah, and that's inherited from our parents or from our culture. And I mean, I don't want to rag on your country. I'd love to live in the States, but there are a few things which scare me. Some of them you've mentioned, like the way that pharmaceuticals are advertised, the way that the healthcare system works, and the food engineering. Oh my God. Like when I went to New York for a couple of weeks and I gained a bit of weight. Normally my weight is super stable within 100 grams on average.
That's super stable.
Year to year even. And yeah, I gained weight while I was there. And because all the food is incredible, the portion sizes are
Yeah.
insulting. Like everything's got
Yep.
syrup with it and stuff, and you're like, that stat of, I don't know what it is, something like the average person gains 8 pounds when they on a 2 week trip to America. I can believe that now because everything's just so plus sized. Plus, that everything's so palatable. So it's got that optimal combination of salted caramel and butter and fat and
Which is
corn
really
syrup, and
chemicals,
so
because most of it's not real.
yeah,
Yeah.
just to fire up you, burn out your dopamine receptors. So of course you combine that with the prison system and the malnutrition of the pregnant mothers, and that drops the IQ of the child who's gonna, all these things, and the plastic exposure. Yes, it's stacking the odds against someone, and then when they turn out a certain way, we act surprised and we throw rocks at them and we judge
Yeah.
them.
No, it's a reflection of society. Like Voltaire said that you can judge a society by how they treat their prisoners. And I think you could say you can use that same thing to like anyone of disparate means. I think what's funny about America is that it once again is a truthful paradox. Because if you come to America and you eat everything that's like presented to you, it's gonna be like terrible food quality, and it's gonna be loaded with sugar and loaded with chemicals that make it taste like like Doritos is a great example. Like it's not really nacho stuff; it just tastes like nacho. It's genetically engineered to to make a.
What
I
even
have
is
no
Cool
idea.
Original?
Yeah, but the thing that's crazy though is because because the states is just so massive. Honestly, is that there's so many niches, and the interesting thing about the internet that I feel like doesn't get talked about enough is that the niches are growing and they're becoming connected even outside of physical distances. So like where I live in the Midwest, you just have to work a little bit harder. But I get like grass fed beef from a farm that's down the street from me. I can drink raw milk, and I don't like go out to eat very often is the paradox of it. You know what I mean? I have to work a little bit harder, but all of it
Ah,
is
cool.
really more accessible than in some places because there's just more distances to be able to create these little pockets of niches, and then with the internet you can access them a lot easier.
Interesting. So it's available, but as you said, you've got to kind of override your default mode, which many people, if they weren't as introspective as you,
I have a hard time.
wouldn't.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, they're imprisoned by their habits. They don't even realize that there are options outside of what they've been doing.
The habits in like Plato's cave, right? Because if you're just staring at the pictures on the wall, what they're going to show you is the burgers and the Whoppers and you know what I mean, all that kind of crazy stuff. But if you start seeking it for yourself versus seeing the pictures that are played in front of you, it's all of a sudden like you're stepping into another world. And there's just a whole like I didn't expect that where I live in the Midwest there'd be like all kinds of raw dairy farms and grass-fed beef and like pasture-raised pork and like a community of people that aren't just eating that but are like really into that and really into like restoration agriculture, which or regenerative agriculture, where you're like taking this monocrop agriculture fields and you're turning it into, multi-crop, a lot of native species, a lot of native plants, and you're actually restoring the soil as opposed to using chemical agriculture. And you wouldn't notice that, but if you look around, you'll see it's everywhere.
Very cool that there are people taking that initiative. I just hope that someone comes along and gives them a leg up with the marketing to match that of the status quo.
Yeah, I think that the internet's fracturizing everybody more. And I think what's going to be interesting is I think the next 10 years is we're going to see the mainstream is no longer the majority anymore, but it's going to fight like hell to make it seem like it is.
Mm,
Does that make sense?
yeah, definitely. It's gonna become a bit of a shell. Like, so I was looking at someone, some YouTuber who has 2 million subscribers, and then I looked. I was like, hang on, how many? Like, what is that? How many is 2 million compared to like Sky News? I looked up Sky News, like 1.1 million, something like that. I'm like, wow. So this one dude, has more distribution than Sky News, and yet there's still this impression, like we have a feeling that like, oh, but that's Sky News, they're a big legit organization, and they must know what's up. But like, maybe that's true, but it's you're right. The balance is really shifting now, and it in quite unpredictable ways.
Yeah, look at the engagement, because the engagement of that 2 million, subscriber individual is probably much higher. Like I do that with the New York Times a lot. The New York Times will that's like the New York Times, the paper of record, as they have been lauded to be. But they'll tweet something out and they'll maybe get like 4 retweets. But somebody else that's like a individual with maybe 1 million versus I think the New York Times has like 20 million YouTube's or 20 million Twitter subscribers. It's something ridiculous, and they'll have way more engagement.
So they're resting on their laurels, or it's just kind of it's going to crumble. It's like Lester Levinson described: once you clear out the emotional drivers behind an old habit, the habit crumbles away like old rope. Like it maintains its shape, but then when it's challenged, it falls away like it's like burnt rope. And I guess it's maybe what some of these institutions will do. They still maintain their shape, and if you look at them, they seem like they're still running, but really they have less and less grasp over people. And I guess the engagement is the leading indicator of that, as you say.
That's a really great quote too. I like that both for the ACE stuff we were talking about a few minutes ago and this institutional rot as well. It's interesting. I think that's definitely true, and I think we're kind of in a balance shift of what people trust, right? Like I think people are starting to fractionize into trusting, their select group of individuals over another select group of individuals, and the institutions are kind of left holding the bag. And really, I mean, the craziest thing to me is how often one news publication will publish a news story and almost the exact same title appear in like across the board. And it's even internationally now too, because I'll see it pop up with like the New York Times, the New York Post, like Fox News even, and then I'll see it with Sky News and the BBC. It's interesting.
Did you ever see that video someone edited together artfully of loads of different news stations, I think local and national, and they were saying the story, but it was like the same line on the teleprompter across all the different... Do you know the one I'm talking about?
I do. Yeah, I do.
Yeah, I found it gave me chills, actually. It was quite a haunting thing to see.
Yeah, I've been running like a news aggregator since 2017. I've just had it like running and collecting all these news stories. And the couple of things from like, the thousands of articles that I've been collecting over the past years, the first things that has shocked me was how often the same title was repeated almost word for word across different news sources, and then how quick it was published. Like I'm talking about like, and it's like not even the same ownership, right? Like my control at the beginning was Fox News, because I was like, okay, like New York Times posts something, Fox News is going to be opposite. It should be, right? Wasn't the case. I was really surprised about that. And it was within like moments. Like sometimes, something with Trump would get announced, and then within moments, all of them would post the exact same article, and it would be like 800 words. And I'm like, how did you all have 800 words queued up and ready to fire? You know what I mean?
So from what I've heard, they write multiple versions of, say, if there's like a binary outcome or something, then they'll just be ready to hit post. Do you think, I mean, I guess it's tinfoil hat time, but do you think this is a coordinated thing? Like, is there a central distributor? Is it just like, are they all just kind of competing for attention and profits, and there's no kind of wider intentionality behind it all? What do you think's happening?
Are you familiar with Manufacturing Consent? Noam Chomsky's Manufacturing Consent?
No.
Okay. It's a great book. His central thesis of it is that there's 5 great filters, is what he talks about, of how news gets to you. It's filtered through these different various mechanisms, if you will. And I won't go into all of them. And I think that what he says is extremely valid. And I think the biggest thing that's valid is in America, Michael Malice puts this the best, and I'll just kind of like succinctly put him before I start giving my own thoughts, which is he says, in America, we're taught that there's a such thing as yellow journalism. So yellow journalism was like around the 1900s, and we're taught that this term was these newspapers are out for themselves, and they were trying to lie and dissuade to be able to push an agenda. And one of the things they tried to push was like manifest destiny, that the United States should own the entire continent of North America from the East Coast to the West Coast and everything in between. Then it was like we should get into World War I. and it was like stoking the coals because Americans, on the whole, didn't want to get into World War One. Until there was like a sinking of the Lusitania, and it was like, remember the Lusitania, and we were told these stories as if they're like archives of how things used to be. So we're told like the newspapers used to lie, and then there's a record scratch, and it's you're supposed to now trust
Okay.
them, right? But the thing is that they always lied. And the best thing for manufacturing consent, that book, is two things. One is it gives you an immense amount of examples of how it never changed, specifically around like the chemical industry, and the war in Vietnam, and the war against the Sandinistas in the 80s. Great examples of how essentially the media was lying and doing this yellow journalism still. Then he starts talking about like essentially that the system of media is set up in such a way so that people who are in their journalist roles don't need to be told, don't write that story. They just know not to write it, but not even from a perspective of I shouldn't write it, my editor will be mad at me. It's we all ideologically think the same thing, so I wouldn't even think to write the article, right? So some of it is
That's a
like
more
the
robust
education.
way to do it, isn't it?
Yes, it is. It's more grassroots, right? So it's partially you're going to hire people that are from a certain demographic and background, and they think like you think, or they think like how you want the continuation of the trend to think. And I say that because of like what we're seeing in the New York Times now, right? So I think that's a big part of it is you select the people that think similarly to you. You also have the same owners. So I think the capital that owns a newspaper or owns a media company is often tied with the interests of other corporations. So editors will come in and say things like, hey, like you can't write that because Rupert Murdoch also owns this, or Jeff Bezos also owns this, in today's example, right? So I think that's part of it too. There's also the advertisers. So you'll see this with brought to you by Pfizer, right? Like, how are we gonna, go against our advertiser saying, maybe their trial data isn't the best, and maybe we should be questioning it, while also the next commercial is brought to you by the same people. Like, you're not going to do that, right? That would be outrageous, right? So I think those things all happen, and I think that those filters help make it so we wouldn't think to run a story against the status quo. The last part of it is also access. So we saw this with Jeffrey Epstein and Prince Andrew, where I can't remember her name. I think her name is Beale. Her last name is Beale. But there was the leaked video of her saying like we had everything on him. We had interviews. We had everything tying Prince Andrew and Jeffrey Epstein together. But they wouldn't let us run it, and they wouldn't let us run it because the royal family said they wouldn't give us access to babies and things like that, right? Of the royal family.
Interesting.
So, but that happens at a larger scale. So, like if I'm doing a story on Raytheon and the amount of money that they're making off of the war in Ukraine, right? Is my editor going to let me run that if the Department of Defense isn't going to give us access to the next time that there's some kind of press conference and they're not going to let us in the room as retaliation for that? Because they can do that, right? Or maybe they're not going to give us the next scoop. So we're going to get something, in the up until the 90s before social media, it was like I might have a week that I get like a story leaked to me ahead of everybody. Now it's like half a day. But that half a day could be everything because then everyone's citing your story as opposed to, the next person's story. So I think all of those factors are the legacy things at play. I think currently we also have this thing called the Trusted News Initiative, which is saying like these are the ways we can talk about certain issues and the points we want to have it said. So I think that legacy, it's you think about the rules of the game, which is we want to keep getting access to these people. These people pay our bills. These people own and play golf with these other people. We got to keep everybody happy. And then in the new world, we also have ideology, which is somehow creeped in. And it's, become in the very fabric of political institutions and then the news that is tied to them, which to me is like wacky. But saying that out loud, usually people don't give you the time to say that. It's more just like, what do you mean? You're against this or you're for that? Like, what? How?
Yeah, I've added that to my list, my reading list. That sounds great. I've had a couple of people recommend Chomsky to me, and I've never fully got around to it. The other thing you mentioned about the the access, I don't know if you saw, you know who Jimmy Savile is.
I think so. It sounds familiar.
So he was some kind of celebrity, well connected guy who was shown after his death to be involved in repeated sex scandals and assaulting people. But yeah, as you say, the signs were all there, and there was even like overt breaking the fourth wall, kind of not even hints, like things that he would say where you're like, "Oh, was that a joke? It seemed a bit off color." And and yet afterwards, you're like, "How did this not get picked up?" Like people were constantly ringing the alarm bells. People were so there's a documentary by Louis Theroux, who is great sort of British journalist who goes into some of these topics, and he went to stay with Jimmy Savile for a while and had a chat with him, and it's really ominous. It's a very uncomfortable watch. If you get a chance, it's definitely worth watching, but it's pretty like squeaky bum.
Yeah, it's. I think about that with Bill Cosby. Like Bill
Oh
Cosby,
yeah, very
there is
similar.
very similar.
Hiding in
Like
plain sight.
yeah, and like there's like a joke in 30 Rock that was written by Hannibal, who's the comic that made that whole thing happen, and it was written like 10 years earlier, where like Tracy Morgan's character like says they tell him Bill Cosby's on the line, and he runs over and picks up the phone and starts screaming him out and saying like, "I'll never forget what you did to my my aunt. She was a cocktail waitress," and it's calling out the exact thing that he was doing on television, and apparently it's like this known secret. But he's Bill Cosby. Like we can't like he's
So
America's
man,
dad.
it's exactly the same story with Jimmy Savile. So you'll definitely see the parallels with it.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to check that out. I find things that hide in plates like I said the obvious. I find the obvious to be so important because so many things get hidden in plain sight because it's the easiest place to do it, which once again is paradoxical.
Yeah, true. Well, I suppose another paradox, which I'm not very well read on, but I saw a comedy sketch which kind of highlights this pretty well, is the left and right on the spectrum basically being a circle, and the very end points that they meet. And it was someone kind of playing on that fact, and he had these two guys that were one was meant to be the left and one was meant to be the right, and they were arguing, and then every time they argued, they'd come to the same conclusion and end up saying the same sentence together. So that, you know, they'd end up with like one's talking about abortion, the other one, and they end up, oh, yeah, well, yeah, because my body, my choice, right? And then it's like, oh wait, you were talking about vaccines, I was talking about abortion,
Yeah, yeah,
and
yeah,
it's
yeah.
they were like, yeah, we shouldn't have an old white man as president, especially not Joe Biden. Oh wait, and it's the way it's executed is really, really well done. So you're like, oh yeah, it does just touch tips at the end.
Please send that to me. Yeah, because I say that all
I
the
will
time.
do.
I was actually just talking to a neighbor of mine, where I was like, there's like people that I know that live in like Boulder, Colorado, and they're like Boulder, Colorado is known as being like a hippie place. So it's a lot of people who are like super into yoga, extremely fit, like don't eat any processed foods, don't eat sugar, like that kind of like stereotypical people. And then you have people who are like the stereotypical down south America, where it's like they're very overweight, they eat a lot of fried food, and they don't really care about what their appearance or body is, right? And somehow both of
Mm.
them agree 100% on the vaccine, the freedom issues, really, which is really what it is. And somehow the two of them can't meet together to see that because it's
Yeah.
the chasm of things between them. It's almost like there's a summation of my ideas, and the summation of my ideas is greater than the individual sum of them, right? And that's where I feel like we are as a idea in a zeitgeist.
Yeah, and I think I mean I was certainly surprised by the strength of the reaction to the whole vaccine thing. I wrote a thread on the COVID vaccine, which was just from a clinical perspective, saying like, here's what we know so far, here's the mechanism of action. It wasn't politicized. It went semi-viral. People got a lot of angry comments from people about it. But I was surprised. I was a bit surprised as to like, whoa, from because most doctors that you speak to, they're kind of like, oh well, like they've got a clinical opinion on it. They might say, oh well, I don't really think it's indicated, or I don't really, or I think it's fine, but we need to maybe iterate on the next version or whatever it is. But it's still very much within the realm of this is a discussion around the relative merits of a treatment intervention rather than this is something which is like core to my identity, you know. And seeing that that shift was so strange, and I could never get my head around it until I saw Z Dog MD, who's a he is a internal medic in the States who, I mean, now he's doing like 4 hours of meditation a day. Like he's deep down the rabbit hole. He sees things from a very kind of wide perspective as well. And he was talking about the Jonathan Haidt's 6 moral taste buds, and how when people see things through those lenses, it starts to make sense. And I guess it kind of explains this dichotomy that you mentioned there of the Colorado kind of yoga bunnies and the Deep South people, and they're both meeting in the middle, but they're maybe seeing it through different lenses. And I've got them here. So we've got the 6 taste buds of care versus harm. So I'm gonna take the risk because I don't want to harm other people, or you know, I'm going to wear a mask because whatever, because I don't want other people to be impacted by that. Compared to the fairness versus cheating, well, oh, he's not wearing a mask, so why should I? There's the loyalty versus betrayal. There's Fauci's done a number on us, and so we shouldn't trust him. And similarly, there's authority versus subversion. Like, you know, who are you to tell me what to do? Sanctity versus degradation, which is the my body, my choice idea. And then there's the liberty versus oppression. And depending on where your relative taste bud is and where your kind of preference is, that's what will dictate your opinion on it. So I guess that starts to put things into place a little bit more. And then it starts to make sense as to why people feel so strongly about it. Because at least in the UK, we're so sarcastic and tired and just don't take authority seriously. Like, you've seen our prime minister, like no one takes him seriously. And so the British attitude to all of this kind of stuff is very much like the naughty kids at the back of the class that are flicking spitballs at the teacher. Like no one's been able to kind of have a strong enough opinion because they're like, whatever, it's all bollocks anyway. So it was such an interesting shift to see on the other side of the pond, people really going in hard about this stuff.
Yeah, well, we're a breed of our own. I think a lot of it has to do. Well, thank you for reading those off, by the way. I really like those, the taste buds. That list is really impeccable, honestly, because it's a great way of trying to orient other people or your own. I think it's most important to always judge your own emotions. I think it's secondary to be interpreting other people's emotions outside of a frame of empathy. That's my personal heuristic.
To figure out our own biases before we can.
Even before biases, like
others.
what emotions is this eliciting in me, right? Because then those emotions are going to be your perspective and how you see the world. It may not even be true, right? Like, if you're anxious, you can see somebody as out to get you, when it's like, no, they were just trying to be charming. You know what I mean? It colors your perspective.
It's the primer for confirmation bias, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. What's interesting to me, though, as I think about our times, and I think there's this Dan Carlin, the podcaster, has this great series on the World War II, but from the Japanese perspective. It's amazing. And one of the things he has in there is like a truism that I've stolen, like a heuristic, which is, he says that the Japanese were like everybody else at that time, only more so. And I think that that's the case with America, is that we are culturally similar to everybody else because we've exported our culture. Only more so, and I think
it's like turbo.
Yeah,
version.
exactly. Including the obesity, but the part of it that I think in this lens is we've kind of shedded religion very quickly, and I'm not advocating for a religion by any means, but not having something that you surrender to, I think I think it's an uncomfortable human need. I think it's an uncomfortable human need to say, like, I have to find some means of believing in the reality around me, because part of our intelligence is that we can manipulate most of our reality around us. And we're, one of the most, I think there's this geneticist I was listening to recently, and they said that genes aren't code, it's expressions to what is potential in an environment. So like you're coded in as a lizard to react to things, not to expect things. And what is fascinating about humans is that you can drop us in any environment on the whole of the earth, and we'll figure out how to adapt and be there. And I think that, and I personally think that somehow that's tied to religion, because we can adapt to everything. We need to have some type of throughput of how to see the world in a way that is, for lack of a better framework, optimistic, or at least like surrendering to something that's greater, because of the fact that we actually have so much power of being able to steward or destroy. We can create something. We can create an ecosystem that thrives, or we can create an ecosystem that's barren rather fucking quickly, because of our desires and our means. And in our current world, I think that things have gotten very easy. I can just get a packaged meal and be done with it. I can spend $20 on a Netflix subscription every month, and I know what I'm going to get out of it. I know I'm going to get a base level of monotonous happiness. I can spend it's probably $200 now to go to Disney World, and I'm going to get $200 worth of fun from it. It's a guarantee. And it's like this commodified everything. It's commodified emotions, commodified outrage. So I think that that's part of it. And I think another part of it as well is the lack of adversity. I think a lot of people grew up without much adversity, or if they did have adversity, they crumbled to it. Back to kind of that ACE stuff. And that's hard to sit with.
Yeah.
And when you have this competing thing of, I don't have a means to understand the world around me from a first principle perspective. What's the first way I should interpret the situation, development, event, ecosystem, environment, whatever. If you don't have that teamed with, I haven't had enough challenges that I've surmounted to get past this, I think what you end up with is a lot of people who are willing to scream at the wind, and a lot of other people who don't have the courage, because they don't have the experience of being courageous enough times to stand up and say, you're fucking outrageous, I'm not going to listen to you anymore. And instead they say, I think you're right. I think you're right.
Yeah, it's a frightening combination of stuff, and I think you've highlighted the different corners of that very well. There's a book that I'm racking my brain trying to remember the name now. Something like The Fragile Mind, or the do you know what I mean? It's about
Wait, it's not Coddling of the American Mind. Okay.
Yes,
yeah, Jonathan Haidt.
it.
Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, similar thing, that we're at a point where, because pleasure is standardized and you can very much live you could have a fully comfortable life if you wanted to, and really minimize your downside, minimize your upside too. But I guess as a result of that, you can, and especially now that, as you say, one of the second order consequences of the internet being into its silos is that we can choose what we want to see and ignore everything that we don't. And I'm guilty of that as well. At the start of this podcast, I said, like, I can't be asked with the arguments, and I just block people that are idiots now. If everyone does that, we end up in a situation where actually we make ourselves sensitized and too fragile to anything that's contrary to our existing view. Now, I'd love you to challenge me on this, because I still don't know whether I'm, falling prey to that same thing, or if it's different somehow. I'm convincing myself that it's different, but maybe that's my bias. But we end up in a situation where we can't handle something that's outside of our kind of defined boundaries. And in the case of what is it? Nope, it's completely gone. It'll come back to me.
Well, what's your point? Is it that you're just walling yourself off, or
that you're walling yourself off, and this is it. So that we used to be adaptive, and you said that you could drop someone into any place in the world and they would be able to adapt. Whereas now, I was thinking, like, if you dropped me in Marrakesh with no passport and no phone or no cash, I'd be screwed. Like, you're thinking, well, okay, what do? You try and find the embassy. Well, how do you do that? How do you get a taxi? You haven't got any cash. All these things which, like, even though it's not like you're in a desert, you're in a developed area with people around you, but simple things like not being able to speak the language very well, or being in a not having a credit card, something like that, makes us completely powerless. So I don't know what the solution but we're the combination of we've developed in a certain line, but that's with that has come a cost that we're no longer able to. I'm pretty sure that if this Ukraine thing spreads further west, then they're gonna struggle to recruit a lot of the young men. Like no one's equipped or willing to get involved as they maybe would have been 80 years ago.
Yeah, I think it'll end up being like World War One, and it'll be terrible. Like World War One, the fascinating thing about that to me is that casualty numbers of how many times. Okay, the battle that existed a little east of Paris is the one to look at. I can't think of it. It was like a 48-hour battle, and it was huge. The thing to look at that is how many of the French soldiers shot their own men, which is not something you would think about, and it's because they were trying to desert. World War One, they had terrible time recruiting people. No one wanted to join the war. It was actually incredibly unpopular within their own countries, which is a lesson for history of state possibilities when they have a monopoly of force. And it wasn't just the French that were doing this; it was everybody. And the Americans didn't need to because we came in late, and like we always do, late and advantageous. But it's. I study ancient history a lot, and I've been challenging myself lately because for a long time I've been like stopping myself from going as deep into it as I want to, because I'm like, what virtue, what good am I gonna get at studying Julius Caesar as much as I want to? Like, this isn't involved in my career. I should just keep learning other neural nets and things like that'll make me like tangible amounts of money or whatever.
I think there's certainly worse ways to procrastinate. I think
Yeah, most certainly.
But yeah, you're right that like we've seen how much of a struggle it was to get people to put a bit of cloth on their face. So to then say, right, you now need to go and shoot and kill other like people that you don't know and go to this country and like I just can't see that happening.
Well, it'll depend on the mind virus that gets spread, because it's either going to be no one's going to go or everyone's going to go, and both of those things are terrifying results. And I think that we live in a time where either of those are possible. But I think what's interesting when studying ancient history is what peak civilization looks like. And I'm looking at us more, and I'm looking left and right into the Western world, and I'm seeing us more as past peak and what that means. So like if you look at the peak Roman Republic, okay, if you were a male that was born at pretty much any social strata, you were taught certain things. You were taught how to go into a river in the dead of winter, swim for an extended period of time, like an hour and a half, and survive in freezing cold river water. It's below freezing outside. Get out, not die, right? That right there, would anyone be able to do that? Like, not many. And then learn how to use a javelin, and you'd go through a whole series of things of like martial training, and then you'd go in a field and you'd work in a field for a while, and you tend goats and cattle and all that stuff. And you were taught this even if you were, a senator's son, or if you were, an artisan, or you were, a slave. Literally, everyone was.
That's the standard training.
What it meant to be, right? And then when it started becoming an empire, and money was kind of coming in, ease was coming in, things were more available. Well, then that went away because you didn't have to train like that anymore. We had people that are hired or become professional soldiers. We don't need everyone to be ready to be a soldier. So then, and then before you know it, like later Roman Empire, they're doing anything they can to get people to have babies. No one's having babies, and they're like paying people to do that. No one really knows how to do anything. And what happens? The barbarians use the roads to be like, oh, this is a highway that I could go to sack Rome, and they'll just keep sacking Rome, because once they get past the gates, no one's there to actually defend them, because no one knows how to do much outside of very specialized domains, like things like people who specialize in finance start coming in. People who are just doing logistics come in, right? And you lose this plethora of all of these different things that I think the paradox of our time is that we have two different groups of people that are emerging. And I can see this in my own life, which is the people, that I would put the camp I would put myself in, which is like, I want to learn how to do everything. I want to learn the basic foundations of how to make myself a well-rounded person in a way. I personally have the luck that I spent a long time being raised by my grandfather, who's like 2 generations away from me, was born on a dirt floor, and he just had to know how to do all of these things, right? So like as a millennial, that's an interesting perspective because most folks don't have that. But I still see that with like what I was saying, like the regenerative agriculture community. They're very much like, how can I do these seemingly basic things and learn how to survive? And then you also have the other group of people who are no, I want to maximize everything. I want a subscription box for my clothes. I want, this complete signed up for life. And outside of most peak civilizations, I think that we have that duality happening. Well, it's really a gradient. It's not a duality. I'm just framing it that way for argument.
But it makes sense. And, I'm not casting any value judgments on that, because I think it's the same as it's, you pay your money, you take your choice. Like, do you want to invest in government bonds, or do you want to do,
Crypto.
small cap? Yeah, crypto.
Yeah.
So, one of them is hedged downside. You know what you're getting. It's very, the path has been well trodden, or you take the risk and you figure it out yourself. But I guess what you're getting at there is that it introduces a massive amount of fragility, or vulnerability, I should say, is the main thing. That if there is an external shock, we are really going to be screwed, and we're going to be repeatedly screwed. When, I don't know if you've seen some of these, there's a certain tone that these are shared on Twitter, where like they'll take a TikTok of some 20-year-old kid dancing, and they go like, oh, this is what society has become now. And yeah, it's kind of satirical, and I'm sure it's not representative, but you see it and you think, oh, it's a little bit scary, because it's getting close to the bone now, that if that becomes the new accepted way to behave, and that becomes the only, I guess, because it's a sign, it's a siren of a cultural shift. And when you see it, you go, oh, okay, we are heading towards the iceberg, and there's nobody actually heading the ship, because the ship is run by an AI algorithm optimizing for engagement. Oh well, here we are. We're heading straight for the iceberg. I'm just going to sit and have to watch as we gradually approach it.
It is. So yes, I think that that's the case, and I think the interesting thing is that's probably been the case for all of civilized time. We're always heading towards an iceberg. I think that the only thing that's unique to our time is the pace. I think the pace is what's unprecedented right now.
I'm not sure I'd agree, but I'd like to hear what you.
Okay, so the fragility to external shocks is the point that I'll tie it with, right? I think that that's 100% the case, right? So I think for a system, any system, to be sustainable, I think it needs to grow slowly, right? So like if you're Netflix, I'll use Netflix as an example. Netflix grew exponentially by introducing streaming, right? And then they were like, okay, cool, we're going to make your own movie studio. We're going to make your own movies. They grew exponentially again. Well, now what's happening? There's a snapback. Other people picked up on their tricks, and they're doing it because they grew too fast in order to do it. Where if they grew a little bit slower, well, then maybe they'd understand like what it takes to make a hit movie before all of a sudden just smattering and throwing us out there. Maybe they'd understand what it takes to build a sustainable streaming platform, and they'll do that and be able to handle that user load, and so on and so on and so forth. So, with our current society, new technologies get introduced, exponentially grow, and we don't have the moral capacity or the societal capacity to contend with those. So I think that it makes us externally vulnerable. If I was to take Rome as an example, right? They were always having barbarians at the gates. I've talked about this before. It's funny, but it's true. I was in a hot tub at a gym once, and this like older guy, was talking about Alexander Hamilton and how he set up the American economic system to be corporate based and corporations. And I just like was going to let him go off. But then he said some things and I was like, that's all wrong. Like, no, none of what you're saying is true. So I had to come in and kind of like lay the smack down a little bit of like, no, you're actually saying things that aren't true. And his response was, are you like a historian? And I was like, no, I don't know anything. No, I'm not. I just know Alexander Hamilton really well. And I know ancient Rome. And he was like, have you read Gibbon? Gibbon is this guy who wrote The Rise and Fall of Rome. And it's like this like epic thing he wrote in like the late 1800s. And Gibbon's thesis is that Rome fell because of Christianity. And this guy says that, like, do you agree with that? And I go, no, I don't agree with that. First off, I think Christianity was infected by Rome, not the other way around. And I'm surprised that it didn't collapse 1,000 times beforehand. Like there's like a crisis of the 3rd century that's famous in Rome, where there was like multiple, like over the course of 90 years, like there was like 3 emperors a year or something ridiculous. Like they were just constantly changing hands. I mean, Rome was sacked early on by Gallic people, and there's the whole like woe to the vanquished, which is essentially like the founding motto of why Rome was so brutal, which is essentially like they came in, they said, we're going to pay you this much gold. You're expecting for more gold. They say, whatever, we just conquered you. Give us everything you can. And there's all these other examples of tiny little things that happened that have like the thread of almost collapsing. Like they almost collapsed right here. And there's so many of those examples throughout. And the fact that they didn't is what's more shocking than the fact that they did. And I could say the same thing about the British Empire, right? There's so many different examples of like where they almost fell, right? Even America, like in the course of the, couple hundred years we've been around, and the couple hundred, almost 100 years that we've been, 80 years that we've been like the global power, multiple points along the way where it was like, man, like we could have really imploded. And I think that today's society is the same. Like I think that this type of internal implosion is something that I would actually say is an inherent feature of civilization, full stop. Like think of like, was it 1816, the year without a summer or something like that? And how much there was a famine within Europe because the crops like failed. So I think that, having something that is so interdependent and reliant upon each other, which is what civilization is, inherently means there's shocks that are possible and like vulnerabilities. I think now we're more vulnerable because the pace of those shocks and changes of technology is so much faster.
Right, I see. So I think, I would agree that pace is certainly one big factor of it. I think there's also qualitatively more risks.
Yes.
There are more existential risks that we face now that we didn't face before this. And one of the big ones that I think is heading us towards the iceberg faster and faster is this AI-driven ship that we no longer have inert risks that are approaching us. Because the iceberg in the past, the iceberg was over there and it was doing its thing. Now the iceberg has a mind of its own and it's seeking the ship as well. Because a billboard was maybe the extent of advertisement 100 years ago. Then it became TV ads, which are not, they're still inert, but they're a little bit more in depth. Now they're so customized and so specific to you, and I feel like in the next 5 years, even the copy and the image and everything will be tailored to you specifically. Then we're in a situation where actually we have separate realities created for each person. It suddenly cuts each person off from living in a connected reality. And then we're in a very scary situation because people are completely vulnerable because they're now disconnected from what's actually happening in the world, plus the fragility, the vulnerability that you mentioned as well, the fact that we're totally unequipped to deal with any external shock, the fact that everything's plugged into our pleasure sensors and our reward circuits. I think this is a more of a risk in magnitude as well as pace.
100%. Yeah. So maybe the way that I can adjust what I said is I think we share the same underlying denominators. The same factors that are underlying the fragility is the same as it tends to be in civilizations. But the matrix of what comprises each of those vulnerabilities is both increased in magnitude and number, right? Because nuclear weapons is like the example it's easiest to go to. But something else is also just like the chemicals that we use. Like, DET was used constantly in the 70s until they found out, like, holy shit, we're about to exterminate our entire bird population. Like, straight up, we're just about
Oh
to get
yeah,
rid of birds if we don't stop this. You know what I mean?
God, and I think I can't even imagine what the consequences of that
Right?
would be. And I guess the human equivalent is that our sperm count is just tanking and tanking, and we keep changing the reference range.
I
We keep
know.
saying, "Oh no, this is now normal."
I
Like,
know. Yeah, no, I mean, like, I'm gonna have to go in a few minutes, and I wanted to talk about health more, so maybe we can talk again sometime about that. But like
for
sperm
sure.
counts and testosterone in men, like a year ago, I spent about 6 months like insatiably reading about testosterone because I had no idea. And what I mean that is like I just entered a world, and I was like, why the fuck wasn't I taught this as like health 101? Like, hey,
Mm,
you are a man. What is being a man? Well, it means you have testicles. What do testicles do? They produce sperm. What else they produce? What helps them produce sperm? Testosterone. That is a fundamental building block of who you are as a being for the rest of your life. And the easiest analog I started to download is like, oh my god, testosterone is like nitrous for engines. It like supercharges everything. And the second that takes a hit and it starts going down, it affects all your body systems because it's affecting all of your body systems. And that shook my reality because I was like, why? Well, first off, why isn't this talked about? And second off, testosterone rates in men in the Western world is going, it's inverting,
yeah,
and plastics have a lot to do with it, which is insane. And then like what that's doing for generations down the line because of being born with essentially low testosterone and because of like phthalates and other things in plastics, it's an innumerable amount of factors that we're facing, really.
yeah. It's a real it's a concern for me from an existential level, but also on a personal level because I'm spending so much of my energy trying to optimize and squeeze out the final couple of nanomoles of of testosterone myself because I'm trying to gain muscle and trying to lose fat, trying to optimize my performance. And it just feels like you've got all these like saboteurs that are trying to ruin it for you. Food processing, the cosmetics, plastics, storage, fragrance devices, everything seems to be conspiring. Receipts, carpets, polyethylene containers. Literally, like it's so ubiquitous. And I guess something you mentioned a bit earlier that there is a that I actually feel now that um, it's no longer just something that we've stumbled on and we're like, oh shit, there's causing a problem. I think the data is now so insurmountable, it's so clear and unequivocal that this is causing a problem. But somehow industries manage to muscle their way through and just go, don't worry guys, like you can ignore it. It might act and look like estrogen, and it might act on the receptor, but no, don't worry, it's not causing any health problems. And I don't know at what point it's gonna maybe we're gonna have to get to the point of no return where we actually become infertile for them to go, "Oh, whoops, maybe that was us."
I don't even know if they'll do it then. I think they'll just be like, whoops, we have this solution to it. Like,
Oh well, yeah. Um, I did. I don't know if you've seen, but I did a self experiment. I took a blood test 12 weeks apart and eliminated as many sources of artificial estrogen as I could from my life, and I did see a change in my blood levels, not just in free testosterone, but in SHBG and estrogen levels. And my testosterone went from below the clinical level for a 70-year-old man to the kind of mid to low end of the range. So it wasn't dramatic, but it went from subnormal to normal. And then I've had another couple of blood tests a couple of years later, having maintained those behaviors, and now it's at the high end of normal. So obviously, it's only 4 blood tests. I can't say for sure whether one thing caused the other, but I've made no other real changes to my lifestyle, and it's good to know that currently there are still things you can do to avoid it. Some quite simple ones, stop microwaving plastic, stop using. Why do we need apple blossom scented dishes? We don't need fragranced washing up liquid. Like they just bang flavoring parfum into everything. Looking out for ingredients, things that say parfum, fragrance, These are catch-all terms that they use to hide the nastier compounds under, and they say proprietary blend, so that they hide behind the kind of corporate competitive, anti-competitive thing.
Right.
But really, it's just so that they can. It winds me up. It really does.
Dude, I'm right there with you. Especially because of it seems all consuming, just because like I don't experience anxiety very often. It's just like not an emotion that I tend to get. But if I go into like a drugstore, I get it really bad, and it's like borderline panic attack, because the second I step in there, like I don't, like my wife and I are pretty. You would think we were hippies, let me put it that way, but we're not, right? So like we eat like pretty much Whole Foods everything. Everything is like we're starting it from scratch. We eat a lot of we switched from being plant-based, and now we eat a lot of grass-fed beef, which is hilarious if you ask me, because we're kind of like on the other end of the spectrum now. But we, like we don't use any like perfumes or colognes, or like our soaps like may have scents to them, but it's like essential oils, and it's not like the chemical compounds. And now that I've noticed that we've been doing this for several years, I'll walk into like a Walgreens, and the second I walk in, the smell is overwhelming, and it gives me a
Yeah, it's
headache.
crazy how. Yeah,
And my heart rate will just shoot up, and it's like so like even just smelling it, my heart rate starts going, and then I walk through the aisles, and it's just like stacked upon stacked upon stacked upon stacked of things that I would never consider buying anymore, because it's like this has no value.
the problem is, like, there's not just the scent, but there's the additives to make the scent carry further,
Right.
to give it an extra 30 centimeters of reach. There's the propylene glycol to help you absorb it into the skin. And, there are hormones are fat soluble. They are designed to be absorbed through the skin. You can wear estrogen patches. You can apply testosterone gel into your skin and it'll be absorbed. So the delivery mechanism is there. And you imagine you've got a compound that is replicating estrogen in the body, and you're applying it in your cosmetics transdermally with propylene glycol. It's going to affect your serum levels. We've seen the data for that. We've seen even the data from wearing clothes that have been washed with scented detergents will affect your blood estrogen levels. Like, I sound like I'm being paranoid, but the effect is so profound, and for the sake of making little substitutions, it totally makes sense.
Yeah, and it's okay. I'm gonna say this as a means of setting this up. Do you know who Joseph Goebbels is? It's a hell of a segue.
The Nazi?
Yeah, the
Yeah.
Nazi. Yeah, so he was a
Just
Nazi
checking he's not
propaganda.
like a modern podcaster or something.
No,
Like,
that'd be hilarious. No, that'd be a terrible name for him. I would have to you have to change your name. It's like being Jeffrey Dahmer or something. No, so he was the propaganda minister for Hitler, right? And he has this idea, which is scary because I think it's what's being employed across the board now, which is really just a plug for how much Nazi science is everywhere. We don't realize it, which is also kind of scary. But anyways, that's a funny one. Anyways,
yeah.
So he had this idea of propaganda, and his idea of propaganda was the opposite of Mussolini's. So Mussolini was, I'm going to have a ministry of truth, and I'm going to say what you can and cannot say. Now, the Nazis did that, for sure, but their main action was to flood what is available. So instead of trying to focus on diminishing what is being talked about, I'm instead going to just flood it with other things.
Just irrelevant things.
Irrelevant things, or just like different talking points, right? So like you're saying, like I sound like I'm overreacting, or I sound like I'm tinfoil hat, and the reason you feel that way is because of how much the waterfall of information that makes it seem normal. And you don't, it doesn't even have to be like saying scented detergent is good. It could even just be advertising scented detergent enough times through enough different various mediums of getting to you that you don't even think to question it, because it's like rope-a-doping you. It's like, look over here, look over here, look over here. Don't look at my other hand. It's going to hit you in the face. Right?
Yeah. It's a I'm gonna have to read some of these recommendations from you, man, because it's a lot more insidious than I once thought. And I always kind of rely on the defense mechanism of, oh well, I'm a doctor, I don't know about this political stuff. But I think it's starting to integrate and connect so much that Um, I need to see how history is repeating itself.
Yeah, it. Well, I would love to keep talking with you about that because I wanted to talk to you about, like, most particularly, I wanted to ask you about testosterone and things like that, like fitness and all of that, because I think that that's fascinating, and also something that I think there's like a real movement of people trying to get like peak sapien become. That's the way that I like to think of
Yeah.
it. So I want to be the peak homo sapien. And I think that that's amazing. And I think a lot of what you've been doing with propane, I was looking at you guys, like I think it's really cool. I
Thanks,
want to
man.
hear more about your story too, of how you went to be a doctor in order to do that. That's really fascinating to me.
Yeah, well, for sure. If this was valuable to people listening, please get in touch with John. Happy to come back for a round two, and we can do a an optimization one. If people have any specific questions as well, happy to field them too.
Excellent. Yeah, I'll put that out to the newsletter, and we can make that happen. Well, we can wrap in a second, but before then, thank you very much for coming on. This was a lot of fun.
For sure, man. Yeah, really enjoyed it.
Thanks. Do you
Cool.
stop the
So
recording? Do I stop the recording?